Cops planted drugs to frame an innocent woman, but they didn't count on the truth. Lisa Carter was never one to seek attention. At 27, she was a dedicated social worker in Fairview, spending years helping struggling families and guiding at-risk children away from the cycle of poverty and crime. But on one fateful night, her life took an unexpected turn. Flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. A police car was pulling her over on a deserted road, with no witnesses in sight. As Lisa eased her blue Toyota Camry to the shoulder, she tried to stay calm, but an unsettling feeling crept over her. Two officers stepped out of the patrol car. Panners, tall and stone-faced, approached her driver's side window, while Carrie, his eyes watchful, circled to the back of her car. "License and registration," Panners ordered, his voice firm. Lisa complied politely, but an odd sense of unease grew inside her. She hadn't broken any traffic laws. "Your taillight's out," Panners said, glancing over her documents. Lisa frowned. She was sure her taillight had been working just fine, but she knew arguing wouldn't help. "I wasn't aware, officer," she replied calmly. "I'll get it checked as soon as possible." Carrie stepped closer, shining his flashlight into the car. Then, suddenly, he said, "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Lisa blinked in confusion. "Is there a problem, officer?" She kept her voice steady, but her heartbeat quickened. "This isn't a negotiation," Panners snapped. Lisa took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out. In the next few moments, she realized something was terribly wrong. Carrie leaned into the driver's seat, rummaging around. A chilling wave of fear crashed over her as he straightened up, holding a small plastic bag filled with white powder. "Found this under your seat," Carrie announced, raising the bag like a trophy. Lisa froze. She had never seen that bag before in her life. "No, that's not mine," she gasped, shaking her head, her voice cracking with panic. Panners smirked. "Yeah, they all say that." Everything happened too fast. One moment, she was heading home after a long day at work. The next, cold metal cuffs snapped around her wrists. She tried to reason with them, beg them to check the car's cameras or fingerprint the bag, but Panners only scoffed. "We have the evidence right here," he said mockingly. "You're under arrest." As they shoved her into the back seat of the patrol car, Lisa felt her world crumbling. This wasn't just a random traffic stop. This wasn't a mistake. It had been planned all along. But the officers had underestimated one thing. Lisa Carter was not alone. She had an entire community behind her. And more importantly, she had an unexpected ally, Peter Thenson, a former military veteran with ties to CIA Director Michael Hawthorne. When news of Lisa's arrest spread, the people of Fairview refused to stay silent. Those who had seen her dedicate her life to helping children and families were outraged. They didn't believe she was a drug dealer. And most of all, Peter Thenson made a call to the one person who could bring the truth to light. Officers Panners and Carrie thought they had pulled off the perfect setup. What they didn't realize was that in just a few days, the web of corruption they had hidden for so long would start to unravel. And soon, the truth would come to light. Lisa Carter's life before everything fell apart. Lisa Carter never imagined she would become the center of a legal scandal that would shake the entire city of Fairview. Before her wrongful arrest, she was just a dedicated social worker, trying to do the right thing, one day at a time. At 27, Lisa had devoted her life to helping struggling families, especially teenagers at risk of falling into crime. She was born and raised in East Fairview, a place where dreams were often buried under the weight of poverty, inequality, and discrimination. But Lisa believed that as long as someone was willing to listen and extend a helping hand, there was always hope. From a young age, Lisa had watched her mother, Diane Carter, work tirelessly at 2 jobs to provide for their family. By day, she was a cashier at a small grocery store. By night, she cleaned office buildings. Despite her exhaustion, Diane still found time to volunteer at the local church, helping those who were even less fortunate. Witnessing her mother's resilience, Lisa made a promise to herself. One day, she would make a difference, no matter how small. After high school, Lisa didn't have the financial means to attend a prestigious university. Instead, she enrolled in a community college, studying sociology and psychology. Her professors quickly recognized something special in her, a natural ability to listen, empathize, and never turn her back on those in need. Upon graduating, Lisa didn't hesitate to join the Fairview Department of Social Services, where she could directly support families in crisis. Every day, Lisa drove her blue Toyota Camry across the city, visiting families in need. She worked tirelessly to guide at-risk children away from dangerous paths, connecting them with mentorship programs and support systems. More than once, she had spent her own money to buy school supplies or winter coats for kids who had no one else to turn to. She didn't do any of this for recognition or financial gain. She did it because she believed that justice wasn't just about courts and police officers. It was about kindness and looking out for one another. But no matter how dedicated she was, Lisa couldn't ignore the harsh reality. She was a Black woman in a society still riddled with bias. She was used to the suspicious glances when she entered high-end stores, the security guards trailing her at shopping malls, the looks of disdain from those who refused to believe someone like her could be doing good. Lisa never let those things discourage her, but sometimes she wondered if her efforts truly made a difference. She had seen too much injustice, watched too many good people get crushed by a system that was never built for them. Still, she kept going. To her community, she was Miss Lisa, the person kids could trust, the person parents could turn to when they had nowhere else to go. She never imagined that one day she would become the victim of the very injustice she had spent her life fighting against. One evening, after a long day of work, Lisa left a meeting with her colleagues. They had just finished an intense discussion about new programs for teenagers on probation, and she felt inspired, hopeful. But as she drove home through the familiar streets of Fairview, she had no idea that her life was about to change forever. Just minutes later, flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. A siren cut through the quiet night, pulling Lisa out of her thoughts. She had no way of knowing that, in just a few hours, she would no longer be Miss Lisa of Fairview. Instead, her name would be plastered across headlines, accused of a crime she didn't commit. And the worst part? The men who set her up, Officers Painters and Carey, would still be walking free, believing they would never be exposed. But they had miscalculated one critical thing. Lisa was not alone. The setup by Painters and Carey begins. Lisa Carter was no stranger to being pulled over by the police without cause, but that night, something felt different. As the flashing lights appeared behind her, she took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. Her speed was within the limit. Her paperwork was in order. So why were they stopping her? She pulled over, turned off the engine, and glanced in the rearview mirror. 2 officers, Painters and Carey, stepped out of the patrol car. Lisa had never seen them before, but there was something about the way they moved that unsettled her. This didn't feel like a routine traffic stop. Lowering her window, Lisa kept her voice steady. "Good evening, officers. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Painters exchanged a brief glance with Carey before leaning down. "Your taillight is out." Lisa frowned. Her taillight was fine. She knew this because she had checked her car that morning before heading to work. But she also knew that arguing with the police in the middle of the night was a dangerous path. "I wasn't aware." Thank you for letting me know. I'll have it checked, she replied, keeping her tone calm. Carrie said nothing as he moved toward the back of her car, shining his flashlight. Lisa heard him rummaging around. A wave of unease crept over her. She swallowed hard, trying to think if there was anything unusual in her car. She never carried anything illegal, but she also knew that the truth wasn't always enough to protect her. Step out of the vehicle. Painter's voice was sharper this time. Lisa locked eyes with him. Is there a problem, officer? Painters placed his hand on his hip, looking at her with growing impatience. Are you refusing to comply with a lawful order? Lisa had no choice. She unbuckled her seatbelt and slowly stepped out of the car. The summer night air felt thick, suffocating. As she stood by the roadside, Carrie opened the driver's side door and began searching. She wanted to protest, but instinct told her to stay silent. Seconds later, Carrie straightened up, holding a small plastic bag filled with white powder. Lisa's eyes widened. What the hell? This belonged to you? Carrie held up the bag, his expression smug. Lisa felt the world tilt beneath her. This was a setup. That's not mine, she said, shaking her head, her voice trembling but firm. I've never seen that before. Painters let out a mocking laugh. Sure you haven't. Lisa couldn't believe what was happening. It felt like a nightmare. She wanted to scream, to protest, but she knew it would only make things worse. In the next instant, cold steel snapped around her wrists. Lisa stood frozen, blood rushing to her head as the brutal truth sank in. This had been planned. She looked into the eyes of Painters and Carrie, searching for any hint of hesitation. But all she saw was arrogance, as if they had done this 100 times before and always walked away unscathed. You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, Carrie recited the Miranda warning, his voice devoid of emotion. Lisa couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had spent her entire life keeping kids away from crime, and now she was being labeled a drug dealer. The world around her blurred as they pushed her into the back of the patrol car. Sounds became distant. The crackle of the police radio, the hum of the engine starting, the low chuckles from Painters and Carrie. She stared out the window as the city lights streaked past, distant and unreachable. In that moment, she thought of her mother. How would Diane react to this? She thought of the kids in her mentorship program. What would they think when they saw her face on the news tonight? But more than anything, she clung to the one thought that kept her steady. She would not break. They might have set her up, but they had miscalculated one thing. Lisa Carter was not the kind of woman who stayed silent. The shock at Fairview Police Station. Lisa Carter sat in the cold jail cell, the imprint of handcuffs still visible on her wrists. The sharp scent of cheap disinfectant filled the air, mixing with the damp, peeling white walls. The dim fluorescent lighting cast a dull yellow-gray glow over everything, making the room feel even more lifeless. She still couldn't fully process what had just happened. They had set her up. Painters and Carrie had executed their plan too smoothly, as if this wasn't the first time they had done something like this. She replayed the scene in her mind. The smug smirk on Painter's face as he cuffed her, the triumphant glint in Carrie's eyes as he held up the plastic bag of white powder she had never seen before. They weren't afraid of being caught because they were used to manipulating the truth. But she wasn't going to let this end the way they wanted. The cell door creaked open, and a female officer stepped inside, her expression a mix of indifference and unease. You have a phone call. Lisa blinked, her heart pounding in her chest. Who was calling? She stood up, forcing herself to stay composed as she followed the officer out. The station buzzed with the usual sounds: clacking keyboards, crackling police radios, and scattered conversations between officers going about their routines. But for Lisa, all those noises felt muted beneath the weight of her own fear. She was led into a small, dimly lit room where an old landline phone sat on a scratched metal table. The officer gestured for her to pick up the receiver. "Hello? Lisa, it's your mother." Diane Carter's voice came through, steady but trembling. Lisa closed her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Mom? What happened? I heard you were arrested. They're saying you were caught with drugs." Lisa clenched the phone tighter. She could hear the pain and confusion in her mother's voice. "Mom, I didn't do anything. They planted it. I swear." There was a pause on the other end. Then Diane exhaled, her voice firmer this time. "I believe you, Lisa, and I won't let this disappear into the dark." Lisa opened her eyes, a surge of gratitude and hope rushing through her. "Do you have anyone helping you?" Diane asked. Lisa bit her lip. "They assigned me a public defender, but you know how it is. He's overworked, handling too many cases." "Don't worry, baby," Diane said, her voice steady with determination. "I'll find a way. You are not fighting this alone." Before the call ended, Lisa promised her mother that she wouldn't lose hope. As she placed the phone back on the receiver, the female officer lingered for a moment, as if debating whether to say something. But instead, she sighed and led Lisa back to her cell. The nightmare wasn't over, but at least she wasn't alone. Across the city, Peter Thinson set down his phone after finishing a call with Diane Carter, his brows furrowed, deep in thought. Peter wasn't a man easily rattled, but something about Diane's story didn't sit right with him. He knew Lisa. He had met her at several community events where she spoke passionately about programs to help at-risk youth. She wasn't the type to be involved with drugs, let alone a dealer. Standing by the window of his office, Peter gazed out at the city lights of Fairview glowing against the dark sky. Something about this case was off. Peter had heard too many stories about planted evidence and corrupt cops to believe this was just another routine arrest. The bigger question was, why Lisa? He picked up his phone and dialed a number, a contact within the Department of Justice who could help him dig into the truth. "Hey, I need a favor," Peter said without hesitation. "There was an arrest in Fairview last night. A woman named Lisa Carter. I need to know exactly what happened." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds, before a low voice replied, "Are you sure you want to go down this road, Peter?" Peter smirked, his eyes sharp with resolve. "I've never been more sure." The nightmare at the police station. Lisa Carter sat on the cold metal chair in the interrogation room, her wrists still bearing the marks of the tight handcuffs. Outside the door, the sound of footsteps echoed down the empty halls of the Fairview police station. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, adding to the suffocating atmosphere. Across from her, Officer Painter stood with his arms crossed, his sharp gaze slicing through her like a blade. Beside him, Carrie leaned against the wall, holding a file in his hand, a smug expression plastered across his face. Lisa took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the unease in her chest refused to settle. She couldn't believe she was sitting here, being so blatantly framed. Painters leaned forward, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. "Lisa Carter," he said slowly, "we found a bag of drugs in your car. Care to explain?" Lisa met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "That's not mine," Carrie chuckled, flipping through the file in his hands. "The classic response," he mocked. "We've heard it 1,000 times. Everyone's innocent until the evidence says otherwise." Lisa clenched her fists beneath the table. She knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a setup, a carefully orchestrated trap. "I want to speak to a lawyer," she said firmly. Panners raised an eyebrow, tilting his head as if evaluating her. "A lawyer?" He smirked. "You think a lawyer is going to get you out of this?" Carrie stepped closer, dropping the file onto the table with a loud thud, his eyes gleaming with provocation. "Look, Lisa," he whispered, his voice as smooth as a snake's hiss. "You can keep denying it, but that's only going to make things worse for you. You have no record, right? Good. But with this charge, you'll be branded for life." Lisa bit her lip, forcing herself to stay calm. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, emphasizing each word. Painter straightened up, shrugging. "Who do you think is going to believe you?" He scoffed. "Who are you? Just some no-name social worker? And us? We're the police. We have badges, authority. Who's gonna stand up for you?" Lisa felt a tightness in her chest. They really thought she had no one. They really thought she would just surrender. She lifted her chin, her eyes burning with determination. "I don't know who will believe me," she said, "but I know the truth will come out." Panners narrowed his eyes, his expression darkening. "Then let's see about that," he muttered before motioning toward the door. The interrogation room door swung open and 2 officers stepped in, grabbing Lisa by the arms. "Take her back to holding," Painters ordered. Lisa didn't resist. She wasn't about to give them any excuse to escalate. But as she stepped out of the room, she cast one last look at Painters and Carrie, memorizing the faces of the men who had thrown her into this nightmare. She wouldn't forget, and she certainly wouldn't give up. An unexpected ally across the city, Peter Thenson placed his phone down after his conversation with Diane Carter. His brows furrowed as he sifted through the documents spread across his desk, the words blurring together as his mind raced. He had heard of Lisa Carter, a passionate young woman dedicated to her community. Someone like her didn't just end up entangled in a drug case. Peter leaned forward, dialing another number. "Hey, it's me," he said, his voice low and resolute. "I need you to look into an arrest in Fairview, a woman named Lisa Carter." There was a pause on the other end, then a familiar voice responded. "Anything special about this case?" Peter smirked slightly, suspicion gleaming in his eyes. "Just a feeling," he murmured, "but I want to be sure." In a world full of corruption and injustice, Lisa was not alone. She didn't yet know that beyond the cold walls of the Fairview police station, a powerful man had started moving the pieces. And the truth wouldn't stay buried for long. The whisper of justice. Lisa Carter sat motionless on the hard bench inside the jail cell. The harsh fluorescent lights cast a dull glare against the gray walls, making the space feel even colder and lifeless. Around her, other women sat in silence, some watching her with curiosity, others with quiet sympathy. She didn't belong here. Her hands still trembled slightly, the lingering ache of handcuffs pressed into her skin after hours of confinement. Her thoughts raced. How did this happen? How had she been dragged into such a horrifying conspiracy? Just yesterday, she had been standing in front of a classroom, speaking to kids who needed guidance. Just yesterday, she was a respected social worker. Now, she was being treated like a criminal, locked in a freezing jail cell, framed by corrupt officers who saw her as nothing more than a disposable pawn. Lisa closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. She thought about her mother's words. Diane had always told her, "As long as you hold on to your faith, you'll find your way." But how could she hold on to anything when everything was stacked against her? Suddenly, the heavy cell door creaked open. A female officer stepped inside, calling her name. Lisa stood, her legs stiff from hours of stillness. "Your lawyer is here," the officer said, her tone flat. Lisa was escorted down a long hallway, passing by rows of cells filled with murmured conversations. She took a deep breath as she stepped into a small consultation room where a man was already waiting, her court-appointed attorney, Thomas Delgado. Delgado looked worn out, deep lines creasing his forehead, but his eyes were sharp. He nodded as Lisa sat across from him. "I've gone through your case file," Delgado said, placing a stack of documents on the table. "And I have to say, something doesn't add up. You were framed." Lisa's hands clenched. "I know, but how do I prove it?" Delgado exhaled heavily. "Luckily, you're not fighting this alone. Someone else is looking into your case." Lisa frowned. "Who?" "Peter Thinson." The name sent a jolt through her. She knew who Peter Thinson was, a former intelligence operative, a man with influence, and someone who wasn't easily manipulated. "Why would he care about me?" Lisa asked, skeptical. Delgado shrugged. "Seems like he cares more about justice than officers like Panairs and Carey." Lisa bit her lip. Maybe she wasn't entirely alone. Delgado flipped through the file, pointing to several documents. "We've already found some discrepancies in the police report. For instance, both Painter's and Carey's body cameras conveniently malfunctioned on the night of your arrest. Strange coincidence, don't you think?" Lisa nodded, a flicker of hope stirring inside her. "That's not all," Delgado continued. "We may have a potential witness, a former cop named Jerome Walters. He used to work with Painters. He knows things, and he might be willing to talk." Lisa's heart pounded. "So, do we have a chance?" she asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. Delgado met her gaze, unwavering. "We're going to fight, and if Peter Thinson is involved, I'd say the truth is about to come to light." Lisa inhaled deeply, feeling something she hadn't felt in hours: hope. Panners and Carey thought they could bury the truth. They never anticipated the strength of a united community, of people who refused to stay silent. She didn't know what the battle ahead would look like, but there was one thing she was sure of: she would not back down. The fall of the liars. Lisa Carter sat at the witness stand, her gaze unwavering, her voice steady. Today, she was no longer the woman cornered by corruption, no longer the victim of a broken system. She was fighting, not just for herself, but for her entire community, for those who once believed in justice only to be betrayed by those sworn to uphold it. The courtroom was silent as Officer Carey took the stand. His face was pale, his hands clasped tightly together. Lisa watched him carefully, searching for any sign of remorse, but all she saw was fear. Prosecutor Mitchell Rowe cleared his throat, stepping toward Carey with a piercing gaze. "Officer Carey," he said, "would you like to revise your previous statement?" Carey swallowed hard. He glanced over at Officer Painters, who sat behind him. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Carey knew that if he spoke, everything would unravel. But if he didn't, he would be the next one caught in the fallout. A long silence stretched between them. Then, with a shaky breath, Carey lowered his head. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa gripped the arms of her chair, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. This was it. "Then," Rowe pressed, stepping closer, "tell the court what really happened the night Lisa Carter was arrested." Carey stared at the table, choosing his words carefully. Finally, he lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed, and spoke. "The bag of drugs wasn't hers. I saw Painters plant it under the driver's seat." The courtroom erupted. Gasps rippled through the spectators. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Shock, disbelief, anger. A shiver ran down Lisa's spine. He had just confessed. "Repeat that," Rowe demanded, though he had heard it perfectly. Carey swallowed again, then looked straight at the judge. I saw Painters hide the bag of drugs in her car. We didn't find anything during the search, but Painters, he said we needed a reason to take her in. Lisa closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. She had always known the truth, but hearing it from Carrie's own lips sent a fresh wave of rage through her. So, Roe continued, his voice dripping with controlled fury, this was all just an act? Carrie nodded, his voice hoarse. Yes, we set her up. A furious murmur swept through the courtroom. The prosecution's side sat in stunned silence, as if even they hadn't expected such a blatant confession. Lisa turned to Delgado, her attorney, who wore a small, satisfied smile. This was it, the turning point. Painters, who had been silent throughout the trial, suddenly shot to his feet. "What the hell are you doing, Carrie?" he roared, his face red with fury. "You think they'll let you walk? You're a traitor." The judge slammed the gavel down. "Order in the courtroom." Painters glared at Carrie, his breath heavy with rage. But this time, Carrie didn't flinch. He had crossed the line. There was no going back now. Lisa could feel the weight of the moment, the charged atmosphere of the courtroom pressing down on everyone inside. But there was one thing she knew for certain. The battle was over. Officer Painters, the man who had destroyed her life, now stood at the edge of his own downfall, and no one could save him. Justice unveiled. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, like a brewing storm on the verge of breaking. Lisa Carter sat upright, her gaze fixed on Officer Carey, the man who had just confessed in open court that it was Painters who had framed her. Lisa's heart pounded, but this time not with fear, with hope. Mitchell Rowe, the once confident prosecutor, now looked visibly shaken. The confession had flipped the entire case upside down. Lisa took a deep breath, listening as her defense attorney, Thomas Delgado, slowly rose to his feet and approached the witness stand. His voice was steady, sharp. "Officer Carey, let's clarify one thing for the court. You just testified that Officer Painters personally planted the bag of drugs in Lisa Carter's vehicle?" Carey swallowed hard, his hands tightening into fists. He knew there was no turning back now, but for the first time in years, he felt something close to relief. "Yes," Carey said hoarsely. "I saw Painters do it. I tried to object, but I was threatened." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters, officials, and members of the community packed the benches, whispering among themselves. Lisa bit her lip, a surge of emotions welling up inside her. How many nights had she wondered if she would ever have the chance to prove her innocence? How many sleepless hours had she spent fearing that her life was over, all because of the greed and corruption of men like Painters? But today, the tide was turning. Delgado walked slowly, placing his hand on the witness stand, his expression unreadable. "So why speak up now?" he asked. Carey took a deep breath. "I've been silent for too long," he admitted. "I've seen Painters do this to other people, but I was afraid of him. I was afraid of losing my job. I was afraid that if I went against him, I'd be the next one he took down." Lisa clenched her fists. He knew. He had always known. Delgado nodded, turning toward the judge. "Your Honor, I don't believe we need to prolong this trial any further. Officer Carey's testimony makes it clear that Lisa Carter was the victim of a deliberate and malicious setup. Rowe attempted to salvage what little ground he had left. Carey's testimony is uncorroborated. He could be lying to lessen his own punishment." Before Rowe could continue, the courtroom door swung open. A man stepped inside, Peter Thenson, former intelligence officer and the one person Lisa trusted outside of her family. Thenson strode toward the judge's bench, holding a folder in his hand. His voice was calm, but commanding. "I have evidence," he announced. Lisa's breath hitched. Thenson had promised her he would get to the truth, but she hadn't expected him to act at this precise moment. Judge Bowers took the folder, flipping it open. Her expression turned stone-cold serious. "What is this, Mr. Thenson?" "An internal report from the Department of Justice," Thenson replied. "It documents that Officer Painters has been under investigation for years for similar misconduct, but somehow he's always managed to escape accountability thanks to powerful connections." Rose's face went pale. "Excuse me?" Lisa held her breath as Judge Bowers examined the documents. After a long pause, she set them down and turned her gaze toward Panners, who had remained composed throughout the trial. "Officer Panners," she said, her voice firm, "do you have anything to say?" Panners' icy demeanor faltered for the first time. Lisa saw his fingers tremble. He knew his game was over. Judge Bowers slammed her gavel down. "Based on this new evidence, I am ordering the immediate arrest of Officer Painters for evidence tampering, perjury, and abuse of power." The courtroom erupted. Gasps filled the air as officers stepped forward, snapping handcuffs around Painter's wrists. He struggled, shouting in anger, but no one was listening anymore. Lisa turned to Peter Thenson, her eyes filled with gratitude. He simply gave her a nod, as if to say, "It's over." She rose to her feet, a single tear slipping down her cheek. After everything, justice had won. The fall of Panners. The cold fluorescent light cast a harsh glow against the gray walls of the holding cell. Panners sat motionless on the hard bench, his eyes vacant, but his fists clenched tightly. Once a powerful officer, he was now just another prisoner, waiting for the harsh judgment that awaited him. Outside, the atmosphere in Fairview had shifted. Every street corner buzzed with discussions about the police department scandal, about how men like Painters had abused their power, turning justice into a weapon of oppression. And Lisa Carter, once his victim, had become a symbol of resilience. She stood in front of the government building, surrounded by a crowd of reporters. Marisol, her closest friend, held her hand in silent encouragement. Delgado, her attorney, stood beside her, ready to field any questions from the press. "Miss Carter," a reporter raised a microphone, "do you feel that justice has been served?" Lisa took a deep breath. "Justice isn't just about exposing corruption," she said firmly. "It's about changing the system so that no one else has to endure what I went through." Behind her, Peter Thenson watched in silence. He had never sought the spotlight, but he knew he had made the right choice by standing on the side of truth. Meanwhile, inside the Fairview Police Department, tension ran high. Following Painters' arrest, the Department of Justice had launched a full-scale investigation, uncovering other cases he had manipulated. Carey, his once loyal ally, had now signed a cooperation deal with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence. "I'll tell everything," Carey said during his interrogation. "I'll expose everything Painters has done." His confession was like a dagger piercing through the corrupt system Painters had built. One by one, layers of deception were peeled away, giving long-silenced victims a chance to reclaim their justice. The next day, Lisa received a letter from a woman she had never met. "Dear Miss Carter, I am the mother of a boy who was once falsely accused by Painters. I lost faith in justice a long time ago, but you have proven that we must not stay silent. Thank you for fighting." Lisa clenched the letter in her hands. She hadn't just fought for herself, she had fought for people like that boy, for those who never had the chance to speak up. That evening, she stood by her window, gazing out over the city. The glow of the streetlights cast a soft amber hue across the sky, a signal of a new beginning. Fairview would never be the same again. It was changing, and Lisa Carter, once crushed by injustice, was now an essential part of that change. The truth revealed. Lisa Carter sat still in the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly together. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic tapping of the judge's pen against the desk, amplifying the tension in the air. Across from her stood Carey, now called to the witness stand. His nervous eyes darted toward Painters, who sat at the defendant's table, his face rigid with anger, furious yet powerless. I need to correct my statement, Carey said, his voice hoarse. Everything I said before was a lie. Painters planted the evidence in Lisa Carter's car. A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment of reckoning. Lisa's heart pounded harder than ever. Finally, the truth was out. Delgado, her defense attorney, rose to his feet, his voice steady yet commanding. So, you are confirming that Lisa Carter is completely innocent? Carey swallowed hard. Yes, she did nothing wrong. Painters wanted to teach her a lesson. He wanted to destroy her because she dared to stand up against the injustices in Fairview. Lisa tightened her grip. She thought back to that horrifying night, when she was dragged from her car, the cold steel of handcuffs digging into her wrists, the crushing despair of knowing she had been framed. But now, she was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, a witness to the downfall of an entire corrupt system. Painters slammed his fists against the table. "You're betraying me?" he snarled, his eyes burning with rage. Carey turned away, refusing to meet his glare. "I'm tired of hiding the truth." The judge banged the gavel. "Order in the court. We will take a 30-minute recess before proceeding." As Lisa stepped out of the courtroom, she took a deep breath. Outside, dozens of people were waiting. Peter Thenson, the man who had helped her bring this case to light, approached her. "You did well," he said, his voice calm and steady. Lisa smiled. "I just spoke the truth." From a distance, she spotted her mother, Diane Carter, and her best friend, Marisol. Their eyes glistened with tears of relief and happiness. She walked toward them, pulling them into a tight embrace. "We're almost there," Marisol whispered. Lisa nodded, but she knew this wasn't just her victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced by injustice, a reminder that justice could be delayed but never erased. That afternoon, as the trial resumed, Painters no longer smirked with arrogance. He knew the game was over. Carey's testimony had shattered the web of lies he had spent years weaving, and when the judge finally declared his verdict, Lisa closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The nightmare was finally over, and a new chapter in her life had just begun. Light. After the nightmare, Lisa Carter stepped out of the courthouse and took a deep breath. The afternoon air felt fresher than ever. The crowd outside erupted into cheers as she emerged, surrounding her with hugs and heartfelt handshakes. Her mother, Diane Carter, grasped her hand tightly, tears streaming down her face, tears of pain, relief, and triumph. "You did it," Diane whispered. Lisa nodded, but she knew this wasn't the end. She had been exonerated, but there were still countless others trapped in the web of lies, victims of a broken system. Peter Thenson approached, his expression a mixture of relief and contemplation. "I suppose you'll finally get a good night's sleep now." Lisa let out a soft laugh. "Not quite. I still have too much to do." Together, they turned toward the Fairview Police Department, a building that once symbolized protection, but now stood as a glaring question mark over the concept of justice. Inside, Painters awaited his fate, and Carey, once his accomplice, was finally forced to face the consequences of his actions. Following Lisa's case, a federal investigation had been launched. Buried files, falsified reports, coerced testimonies, Everything was coming to light. Fairview had never seen a scandal of this magnitude. Police Chief Elliot Marks, who had shielded painters and his corrupt network for years, resigned in disgrace before dawn. Lisa felt no satisfaction, only relief. But as the crowd began to disperse, as the reporters' flashing cameras started to fade, Lisa understood that her journey wasn't over. She couldn't simply return to life as it was before. What she had endured had changed her forever. A few days later, she returned to the Fairview Department of Social Services. Her colleagues welcomed her back with open arms, but their eyes held something different. They no longer just saw her as a co-worker. They saw her as a fighter, someone who had dared to stand up against a system designed to crush people like her. Marisol pulled her into a tight hug. "Welcome home." Lisa smiled, but deep down, she knew that from now on, nothing would ever be the same. That evening, she sat at her desk, staring at an unfinished watercolor painting she had started before the nightmare began. Picking up her brush, she carefully painted the final strokes, a picture of resilience, justice, and those who refuse to be silenced. As she set the brush down, a sense of peace washed over her. Fairview hadn't changed overnight, but today she had sparked a flame, and she knew that flame would keep spreading, lighting the way for those still searching for justice. The dawn of justice. The sky over Fairview was painted in soft shades of amber as the sun slowly rose. The city remained quiet, but in Lisa Carter's mind, a storm had finally settled. The days of fear, injustice, and darkness had given way to something new: hope. At the Fairview Department of Social Services, Lisa hesitated for a brief moment before stepping inside. Her colleagues were waiting, breaking into applause as she crossed the threshold. Marisol was the first to rush forward, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You're back," Marisol said, her voice thick with emotion. Lisa nodded. "I never really left." But even though things seemed to return to normal, Lisa knew her fight wasn't over. Painters had been arrested. His accomplices were under investigation. But true change wouldn't come from just one trial. It would take much more than that. That evening, Lisa returned to Mount Olive Baptist Church, a place that had been her sanctuary since childhood. As she entered, Reverend Coleman was already waiting, a gentle smile on his face. "I knew you'd come back," he said, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Lisa sat down in the wooden pew, gazing up at the cross on the wall. For years, she had learned to forgive, but this time, forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. She had to remember, she had to act, to ensure that no one else would suffer what she had endured. 3 weeks later, Lisa stood before the Fairview City Council, a petition in her hands. She had gathered hundreds of signatures from residents demanding an independent oversight committee to monitor law enforcement. It wouldn't be easy, but the determined faces around her, her supporters, her community, gave her strength. A council member leaned forward. "Miss Carter, do you really think this will change anything?" Lisa took a deep breath. She met his gaze and replied, "If not now, then when?" Behind her, her mother, Marisol, her colleagues, and even the children from her mentorship program nodded in agreement. Lisa's battle had never been just her own. It was a fight for an entire community. After the meeting, as she stepped outside, Peter Thenson was waiting for her. He studied her for a moment before offering a small nod. "You don't back down, do you?" Lisa smiled, her expression unwavering. "Number and I never will." The sun dipped below the skyline, but in Lisa's heart, a new dawn had begun. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. And more importantly, she was someone who would keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved justice. The legacy of Lisa Carter. Lisa Carter's story is more than just a personal fight for justice. It is a testament to the power of perseverance, unity, and belief in the truth. It teaches us that even when faced with corruption, deception, and systemic failure, one courageous individual can ignite change. Her journey reminds us that justice may be delayed, but it will never be extinguished, as long as there are people willing to stand up, speak out, and defend what is right. It also highlights the power of community. When people unite under a shared cause, they can dismantle even the strongest walls of oppression. At the same time, Lisa's story is a call to action, a reminder that we all have a responsibility to hold institutions accountable and push for reform. By refusing to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing, we not only protect ourselves, but also pave the way for a fairer future for everyone. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.